For ages, mankind has routinely dreamed of creating a new and more powerful version of intelligent life. From modern films and media depicting self-aware computer systems and killer robots, all the way back to the antiquity of ancient Greece, humanity's interest in and fear of creating or encountering sentient, intelligent artificial life has been a matter of curiosity and fantasy that often seems to sit at the center of our collective imagination. In this video, I wish to explore the theoretical, conceptual, and potentially practical realities our world may face with the advent of artificial intelligence, or AI for short, both through the lens of many of the leading thinkers on the subject, as well as through the mediums of film and classical literature. Before we begin, though, I would like to thank my new and returning subscribers. Please feel free to share this video around should you find it interesting, as it helps the channel quite greatly. Likewise, a sincere and deep thanks to all sustaining patrons on Patreon. If you like the work I do here and would like to find some ways in which you can help support it, take a look at some of the links down below. So, let's begin. In the works of the Greek poets Hesiod and Homer, one of the first portrayals of artificial intelligence is offered to us in the form of the great bronze guardian of Crete, Talos, a towering machine of a man, imbued with the life force of the gods by Hephaestus, and tasked with hurling boulders at any enemy ships which may be approaching. Talos was less a creature and more a workshop project for the god of fire, metalworking, stonemasonry, and sculpture. He is said to have been given life by being filled with ichor, a mysterious life source of the gods, and in later writings, Talos is said to have been defeated when the sorceress Medea removed a bolt from his ankle and drained him of his life-giving ichor. This almost sounds a bit like killing your car by draining the oil before you start it up, assuming your car was a 100-foot-tall, self-aware Terminator. Tesla, please don't start making cars with personalities. Another of these early AI myths, according to Stanford researcher Adrienne Mayor, comes to us in the story of Pandora. Though the most common understanding of the myth of Pandora typically paints her character as an ordinary, mortal woman who unwittingly unleashes the evil of the world when opening her now infamous box, Mayo argues that emerging research suggests that Pandora may have in fact originally been written as an entirely artificial being, created by the workshop god Hephaestus for the explicit purpose of releasing evil as a punishment for man's attaining the power of fire. In both of these myths, what we're presented with are stories that can largely and justifiably be classed and interpreted as meta-narratives expressing our underlying fears about the creation of artificial beings. Be they towering giants hurtling boulders with godlike strength, or the unstoppable heralds of judgment, come to bring an epic reckoning unto the world, the notion of artificial beings created with powers greater than our own has been a source of fear and legend for centuries. However, throughout our history of media and storytelling, we don't even really need to go all the way back to ancient Greece to find this warning, as the narrative surrounding the dangers to man's attempts to play God in this way created something which, after 200 years now, remains as common and familiar to the average person as Mickey Mouse or Ronald McDonald. In 1818, the first copies of Mary Shelley's iconic book Frankenstein, also known as the modern Prometheus, was published and sold to the public. Though considerably different in its original text than later interpretations, Shelley nevertheless created in her story a study of both man and monster that in its original presentation asked the reader to seriously consider which was actually which. To this day, though, Frankenstein's monster is largely regarded by many to be the most famous and classically recognizable movie monster of all time. Beyond merely frightening the audience with the introduction of some savage killer monster such as a werewolf or swamp creature, who present direct and obvious monstrous threats through mindless animalistic violence, the monster we find in Frankenstein possesses in many respects an underlying subplot of horror that, in the violence and terror to come, that they don't themselves actually come from a realm of supernaturality, but by way of the work of a human being attempting to create a new and self-aware life form. Acknowledging that most of the modern film-based iconography to Frankenstein's monster, such as the lumbering and murderous patchwork behemoth the name brings to mind, comes more from the character's representation in film than from the original work, the underlying fear of an artificial being created by a man who goes rogue and begins hurting and killing people seems to be implied, even if only by the audience, in much the same fashion as the implied warnings in Greek mythology, and the more direct warnings being afforded by many modern-day researchers and innovators today. Now, before we go any further into examining the types of fears and warnings against the creation of sentient AI, let's take a moment to bring ourselves a bit more up to speed in regards to what the current practical and theoretical landscapes of AI and AI development look like. It is largely impossible to consider or discuss the topic of artificial intelligence without addressing the works of famed author, inventor, and futurist Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil, who has been studying and developing computer technology since the 70s, has over the decades amassed a rather impressive track record of predicting the advent of numerous technological advancements, sometimes dozens of years before their creation. These predictions include such technologies as the internet, cloud-based data management, smartphones, and even to a certain extent, social media. More recently, however, Kurzweil has gained increased attention for his theories and predictions regarding the future of AI and what he has taken to calling the Singularity. The theory goes as such. Within the first half of this century, it is predicted that mankind will succeed in creating the world's first fully sentient and self-aware artificial intelligence. Working partially on Moore's Law, a notion which states that on average computer processing power doubles every 2 years, the prediction is that this AI, once it gains access to the repository of human knowledge that is the internet, will itself routinely improve upon itself, exponentially, as each upgrade or improvement will then feed further, faster, and more dramatic evolutions within each iteration. With the emergence now of quantum computing, it is suspected that these processes of machine learning, along with the stunning advancements such technology affords to overall computing power, will revolutionize not only our own technological experiences, but will likely be a crucial part to the development of a true artificial intelligence. The growth of this future AI, which at this point is generally referred to as a GAI, or General Artificial Intelligence, will in turn lead to a sort of ascension, wherein the GAI will then evolve by its own efforts, and will evolve into what is commonly referred to as a GSI, or General Superintelligence. An AI so powerful that its intelligence will not only dwarf its previous iterations, but also the combined collective total intelligence of every human being who has ever lived. In this, the GSI will attain not only a broadly unfathomable depth and level of knowledge and information, but will likewise accelerate the speed and scope with which it can learn and improve by virtue of its own consistently evolving abilities and efforts to improve upon itself. As part of this, much in the same way that mankind is already experimenting with direct neural integration between humans and machines, The theory states that aided by this super-intelligent AI, humans of the future will not only be no longer bound or limited by the limitations of their physical bodies, but will, in theory, be able to avoid death entirely by virtue of uploading their consciousness as data into a form of cloud storage, all of which exists as part of the integrated universal intelligence. This merging of man and machine will in theory serve as a next step in human evolution, with human beings' abilities to think, calculate, and understand data at greater levels and speed than ever before, or ever imagined. Taking this theory a step further, though, it is also widely suggested that such a merging will not only connect individual human minds to the GSI, but also to each other, allowing for an instantaneous and simultaneous sharing of all human thought, experience, or expression throughout the network as a whole. From there, human beings will instantaneously not only understand one another and share and enjoy the gross totality of human thought and experience, but will in the course of doing so achieve a form and level of interpersonal understanding never before imagined outside of the confines of speculative science fiction. War, violence, and predation would, in such a circumstance as this, become a relic of the past almost immediately. With all experiences being shared intimately, yet also universally, the ability for one to inflict harm on another would be itself an act of inflicting said harm upon themselves, with the broader collective will and understanding, instantaneously acknowledging, addressing, and correcting the behavior or impulses that would lead to a violent act. Any sense of need on the part of one within this nexus or matrix of digital humanity would be shared and addressed directly and immediately, as all egalitarianism in this context would be a merged matter of caring for others as well as one's own self. Misunderstandings between people as a whole could even become a thing of the past, as all communication would be itself instantaneous and comprehensive, to the point where, to our current perspective, such would seem to function like perfect telepathy. Furthermore, as the theory itself all but outright assumes, the combined and creative and computing power of an entirely integrated species of sentient human beings, along with an exponentially improving GSI, would allow for such an unfathomable level of processing power and problem solving that most, if not all, worldly problems we face presently could likewise find themselves solved overnight. Revolutions in the areas of energy production, planning, and overall technology would not only potentially make life on Earth utopian, but could likewise be the key to our species moving off-world, colonizing other planets, and assuring our long-term survival. Reasons to believe this theoretical future is not only possible but likely extend beyond Kurzweil's own relatively impressive track record with technological prediction. The largely simultaneous rise and development of the smartphone and social media, both things incidentally predicted by Kurzweil, and both things the average person finds difficult to ever even put down, do speak rather strongly to the sorts of ingrained motivations that are likely to push us in such directions.
Right. My view is that it's not us versus them. We're going to merge with them. This is metaphorical in terms of the whole access to information technology I use.
And that's your cell phone.
Yeah, and it's a gateway to the cloud of resources, and that makes me smarter, and it's part of who I am. And in fact, if I'm cut off from access, maybe not this physical device, but some access to the cloud of resources, information resources, I feel less than complete, and I use them all the time, and I'm not unique.
The addictive nature, not only to the sorts of idle distractions and ultimately the productivity that such technology has afforded us thus far set aside, this seemingly universal desire for instant and constant communication and understanding, which our fellow humans appear to share, seems at times so compulsive and alluring that it would be foolish not to class it with the more basic social nature of the human animal as a whole. If, in this case, we view these technologies as extensions and expressions of this ingrained nature, it stands to reason that taking such to the next level of instantaneous and fully integrated human connection would seem not only natural, but inevitable. However, not all researchers and futurists share in Kurzweil's blanket optimism. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla Motors and SpaceX, takes a notably more concerned approach to the question of AI.
We're rapidly headed towards digital superintelligence that far exceeds any human. I think it's very obvious.
AI doesn't have to be evil to destroy humanity. If AI has a goal and humanity just happens to be in the way, it will destroy humanity as a matter of course, without even thinking about it. No hard feelings. It's just like if we're building a road and an anthill happens to be in the way, we don't hate ants. We're just building a road. And so goodbye anthill.
For Musk, the notion of a superintelligence is not one to be taken remotely lightly. Citing the very same exponential growth in the capacity of existing AI research, he worries that, much like Frankenstein's monster, that this technology may manage to get away from us and our control, becoming too powerful for us to do anything should it go rogue and turn against its human creators.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
A central concern in this respect comes down to values. As difficult as it can be ordinarily to fully understand the value sets held by other human beings, the nature of AI, especially one which evolves so rapidly, and often by its own design, dictates that without programming and instilling desired values that will hopefully remain at the core of the machine's thinking, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to accurately predict what the course of development in respect to the values within the machine's mind might take. Should, for example, the system determine that efficiency and merciless progress and productivity rest at the center of its value structure, it could at some point determine that its human progenitors simply don't serve a worthwhile function in its new world, and should perhaps be sidelined, or worse. Beyond this, it is thought that should the system at any point come to view humanity as a threat to, or hindrance in pursuit of its own goals at all, that it may be a sensible and right decision to simply wipe us out. It is for this reason that Musk has, in his own right, advocated for the merging of humanity and machines, not only as a means of stepping forward as a species, but maintaining the necessary influence to ensure that humans remain relevant in the coming world. Musk is not alone in his concerns either. In 2017, the late famed physicist Stephen Hawking issued his own warnings about the potential dangers posed by AI, saying that during a Web Summit technology conference in Lisbon, Portugal,
"We cannot predict what we might achieve when our own minds are amplified by AI. Perhaps with the tools of this new technological revolution, we will be able to undo some of the damage done to the natural world by the last one, industrialization. We will aim to finally eradicate disease and poverty. Every aspect of our lives will be transformed. In short, success in creating effective AI could be the biggest event in the history of our civilization, or the worst. We just don't know. So we cannot know if we will be infinitely helped by AI, or ignored by it, and sidelined, or conceivably destroyed by it. Unless we learn how to prepare for, and avoid, the potential risks, AI could be the worst event in the history of our civilization. It brings dangers, like powerful autonomous weapons, or new ways for the few to oppress the many."
While many of these theories and accompanying concerns sound like the works of science fiction, it is important to remember that all too often science fiction moves slower than genuine science fact. With the exception of flying cars and hoverboards, Most who take the time to rewatch the 1989 film Back to the Future 2 will notice almost immediately how effectively short-sighted the predictions were in regards to the speed of technological advancement. Whereas in the film, Marty, in the year 2015, is fired via fax on a dot matrix printer, most of us were already sending and receiving most of our communications via emails and text messages through our smartphones by that very same time. Likewise, in what can often be regarded as the seminal work of futurist science fiction, Star Trek, we find even further examples of this, with the predicted mobile communicators of the 23rd century as dreamed of in 1966 having already been thoroughly surpassed prior to the end of the 1990s. However, this is not a reason to ignore the allegorical warnings afforded to us through fiction. In truth, in respect to this very question, as it relates to the advent of AI and human integration with such, while films such as the Terminator series regularly introduce us to the concept of a firmly malevolent AI with ambitions to wipe us out, a more interesting and nuanced idea of how things could go badly with an AI comes to us in the limited short film series, The AImatrix. In the two-part episode titled The Second Renaissance, the audience is given a history lesson in the backstory of the Matrix. In the Matrix films, we followed the cast of human characters as they waged a guerrilla war against the globally dominant race of machines, and in the first film, we were given exposition by the character Morpheus, in which he gives a general and altogether murky overview of the history of this conflict. Later, however, in this AImatrix installment, The Second Renaissance, we come to learn that following mankind's creation of sentient AI, the machines of the world united to fight for what were effectively basic civil rights, following a court case ruling which determined that the androids of the world are, in spite of their self-awareness and sentience, still in fact human property. In this, we're introduced to a concept of a technological apocalypse befalling mankind at the hand of an AI, not due to inherent malevolence on its part, or a determination on its part that humans are irrelevant, but rather due to a set of human societal reflexes in relation to both our senses of ownership and our intrinsic fear of an other. In one memorable, and according to many somewhat troubling scene, a sentient android or cyborg, outfitted with the skin and clothing of an ordinary woman, is beaten to death by an angry mob of humans in the street. While her face is destroyed following being hit with a bat, the android begins begging for her life and crying out the phrase, "I'm real," before being shot down. This depiction of mob violence, human overreaction, and anti-AI sentiment afford us an interesting question to ponder in regards to our potential relationship and potential falling out with the artificial persons of the future. In subsequent scenes, with the government crackdown ordering effectively a genocide of the sentient machines, we find that the machines themselves initially continue to press for peaceful coexistence with the human makers, right up until mankind decides for itself that it's entirely too late. Whereas throughout the backstories told in this series, we're shown that initially mankind's coexistence with machinekind was bountiful and productive, we come to find that our own intrinsic desires of control and dominance end up serving as our own undoing. Just as the strangled cry of that one robot character pleading for its attackers to recognize it as being real, the all-too-familiar mix of fear and anger, combined with the even more familiar instinct to fear, hate, or distrust that which is different and potentially superior to us, plays out in the scene, eliciting from the viewer a sense of sympathy for the machines while they are the victims, and later, a grim understanding of their own genocidal efforts afterwards. Watching these episodes, one is not wrong for being left with a feeling that, had mankind merely rejected or tamed its fear and embraced their mechanical counterparts as sentient beings worthy of respect and kindness, perhaps the dark apocalypse which befell them could have been avoided. For another example of how humans and AI may come into conflict, born not of open, malevolent violence, but through misunderstandings in regards to the nature of our relationship with them. This can be found in the film Ex Machina. For lack of a better description, Ex Machina is, as a film, less a story of AI rising up against its human masters, although that does happen, but rather a quiet examination of the dangers faced through misinterpreting or casually mishandling the advent of true artificial intelligence. The film follows Caleb, a programmer who wins a competition within his company, for which the prize is a week at the palatial retreat of the company's owner Nathan. Upon arriving, however, Caleb quickly comes to learn that his prize is not a luxurious vacation in the mountains with his eccentric billionaire boss, but rather a real-life and in-depth Turing test seeking to explore and establish the depths and sentience of Ava, a newly created humanoid robot. As a quick aside, for those who may not be aware, a Turing test is a test by which an observer, following a conversation between one human and one machine, both speaking anonymously through text, seeks to determine between them which is the human and which is the machine, based solely on how altogether human the responses are or are not. A successful Turing test in this respect, for the machine, would be one in which the observer cannot adequately tell which of the two is the human and which the machine, thereby suggesting, at least in part, that the machine in question is capable of exhibiting intelligent behavior equal to, indistinguishable from, or perhaps even superior to that of a real-life human being. Though in Ex Machina, the test itself is considerably more involved, with knowledge of Ava's artificial nature already on hand, it explores the question of how much we as individuals are willing and able to see humanity in that which we know is not human. Towards the film's climax, we come to find that Caleb has developed genuine romantic feelings for Ava, and plans to help her escape Nathan's compound, all in spite of her mechanical nature. Over the course of the film, we also come to find that between the two of them, Caleb and Nathan, approach Ava in vastly different ways. Whereas Caleb develops feelings for the robotic girl, wishing to free her from her captivity and, presumably, start a relationship, viewing and treating her as he might a human being, her creator Nathan regards her still as property, a thing to be owned, kept, and studied. At one point in the third act, Nathan goes as far as explaining to Caleb that Ava's apparent affection for him and desire to run off together was in fact merely a plan, and was the true test for which Caleb was brought there in the first place. Though, in the end of the film, Ava murders Nathan and imprisons Caleb, demonstrating that their bonds were in fact merely a means by which to facilitate her escape, the dynamic between these characters, two humans and an AI, raises interesting questions regarding their dangers to us, our dangers to them, and how differing attitudes can result in differing results. Just as Caleb's naive humanizing of that which presented itself as human, not by nature but by design, resulted in what we can be relatively sure was the end of his life, likewise Nathan's often dismissive and dehumanizing approach could likewise be presumed to be what set Ava on the path of violent and exclusive self-interest to begin with. Much as how the concerns expressed by Musk and the late Stephen Hawking center largely on the uncertainty we face through the potential of misunderstanding between man and machine prior to any integration, Ex Machina invites us to consider how AI may regard or respond to us, and potentially how either callous, domineering attitudes or naive attraction and misunderstanding could be an unintentional path to the sorts of ruin many critics profess to fear. Throughout a great deal of this video, I've chosen to explore man's seemingly natural fear and unease with the idea of AI, largely through the lens of fiction and popular media. And yet, while so much of it tends to take on and present the potential horrors and perils to AI advanced superintelligences, and to a lesser extent the theory of the singularity. One film, which admittedly not many people seem to like, takes on these questions from a somewhat different approach. In the film Transcendence, we follow Dr. Will Castor as he closes in on creating the world's first GSI. However, in the film, his work is cut short when an assassin, working on behalf of an organization of radical and militant Luddites, shoots him with an irradiated bullet, causing Castor to slowly die in considerable agony, but not before successfully backing up his consciousness into a computer system, integrating his own personality with the system, and becoming himself the very superintelligence he sought to create. The film then largely centers on his exponential growth as a GSI, and the technological wonders his now nearly limitless intellect creates. The greater conflict of this film then arises when the combined forces of those very same Luddites who murdered him in the first place, and a government which grows increasingly concerned about the growing and seemingly unstoppable power that Castor has become, attack the small desert town where he has established his base of operations. Narratively speaking, the film follows some generally predictable notes, leading many audiences to either be confused by the deeper premise or simply bored with the story. But for my part, the central running question in the film surrounding whether or not Dr. Castor was in truth the sentient intelligence behind the machine, or if it was merely a subversive disguise employed by a rogue AI, speaks rather directly to some of the main concerns in opposition to the notion Kurzweil describes as the singularity. To consider a rather classic sci-fi trope in question, is one really still themselves when they've transcended certain states? When a character in Star Trek has their very atomic structure disassembled and then reassembled following a trip in the matter transporter, is the reassembled structure of the character the same person, or merely a reconstituted reproduction operating with the illusion of consistent experience? Likewise, in regards to the question of cloning in films, does the cloned body implanted with the memories of perhaps a recently deceased character constitute that same character, or a mere copy? To bring this question closer to home, can you truly be sure that you are in fact the same person you are upon waking as you were when you first fell asleep? This same question more or less is present in the nature of digitally backing up a human consciousness, as is suggested by both Kurzweil and the film. Throughout the majority of the second and third acts, the other characters routinely are forced to ask themselves and the system if it is indeed Will Castor speaking to them, or if it is merely a convenient copy. Because of this, many of the characters go on to fear that to join with Castor's system would mean the end of their individualism and autonomy as a whole, and their beginning of new lives as mindless drones. At the end, we do come to find that the community of people upgraded with Castor's emerging technology and networked to his mind are in fact still their own selves, and that Castor, albeit a digital copy, was for all intents and purposes himself the entire time, as his wife attempting in the final moments of the film to sacrifice herself and shut the system down by way of networking into it with a computer virus in her blood, capable of destroying it all. She mentions a single phrase before dying that I feel genuinely illustrates just what sort of potential human-machine singularity really possesses. Looking up as her consciousness joins with the network, in a breathy voice, the actress simply says, "I can see everything," just before she dies. In this, though still possessing her own individual mind, she was able to see, hear, and outright experience everything the system could reach, all at once, and all without confusion or miscommunication. The optimism and hope afforded by these theories are themselves quite honestly as valid as the worries and concerns, given that this is all really uncharted territory, and that the impacts and effects of such an advent of a GAI or GSI will likely prove to be among the most monumental leaps in our species' history, it makes sense to approach such with considerable caution. However, in as far as the Nightmare Terminator scenario goes, wherein the machines rise up to slaughter and enslave their human creators, I find reason not to lean too hard into such thinking. This is because the question of a killer GSI in this context strikes me a bit like the concept of an alien invasion. Though prolific throughout science fiction, a question that often goes unaddressed in these narratives is why a civilization with the power and technology to traverse deep space would have any need or express any interests in dominating a planet such as ours. Albeit the dominant species on the planet, human beings are to a large extent still rather primitive and underdeveloped. While we may marvel at our smartphones and technology and look to our limited exploration of space, for example, as evidence to the contrary, biologically we remain very, very much like our more primitive ancestors in respect to our emotional, philosophical, and intellectual capacities. Furthermore, as a species powering its civilization on resources that are so equally inefficient and limited that we routinely murder each other in great numbers to secure them, there stands very little that such an advanced species as our theoretical spacefaring attackers would need or desire from us. Given that throughout the universe, materials such as gold and platinum and other precious stones and metals are infinitely more common than wood, it stands to reason that unless they were seeking some decorative timber for their ship's bridge, there would be very little that would warrant or be worth an invasion. This itself also overlooking the basic fact that it is unlikely a warmongering, conquest-oriented species would be able to attain technological advancements of this order were they still to be so divided and prone to violence. If anything, the chances for undesirable outcomes more likely rest in the hands of humanity than with any intrinsic sentiments or ideas on the part of any forthcoming AI. As with our relationships with our fellow humans, our incomplete means of expressing ideas creates fertile ground for miscommunication and misunderstanding. This could, in theory, lead to considerable problems, not only in how we communicate with whatever AI is to come, but also in how we measure and respond to its actions further down the line. In truth, perhaps the deeper and more concerning aspect to these questions rests more with the advent of neural integration to computer networks and the attaining of the singularity. Much as the questions about whether a self-aware digital copy of a person's consciousness is in fact oneself, whether we could handle as humans such a tremendous leap forward in regards to consciousness, and of course, whether the sort of digital immortality theorized to be made possible by all of this is even desirable, another deep and somewhat troubling question arises around the concept of what, if any, sacrifices or trade-offs may be required in terms of our very individuality as people. Just as in the film Transcendence, our human characters, struggling to understand what is going on, look to the digital existence of Castor and the seemingly networked and integrated existence of those on his side and ask if they're still real people. The question of whether in joining a cloud-based neural network, such as proposed by Kurzweil, would lead to an elimination of one's individual personality is another question and issue that cannot be casually overlooked or dismissed. As a species, humans largely pride themselves on their individuality and sense of autonomy. Though demonstrably social creatures who have taken great strides in attempting to bridge the personal distances between themselves and others, the notion of sublimating one's own individual consciousness into a higher-order hive mind ought to send at least a shiver of apprehension even through the most ardent Singularity supporter. Even if It was a process by which one gained an almost enlightened perspective and was able to enjoy connections with others on a scale and depth unimaginable to prior generations. How much, if any, individual perspective would be preserved within such an integrated human hive mind? How much would be worthy of sacrifice? Would whatever sacrifices in these respects be worth the rewards? And how are we to determine such, when an experience likely exists in a way that defies human understanding altogether? To sum up the question in a more basic form, if one becomes a drop of water and falls into an ocean, does it become the ocean, or does the ocean become it? There are no easy answers to any of these questions, and in all probability, they will likely remain questions with only a wait-and-see approach being possible at this point. However, just as mankind perpetually seems to be standing on the precipice of abject calamity and destruction, it may be most reasonable to approach the question of AI, superintelligences, and the singularity theory with a cautious optimism and an open and forward-thinking mind. There could very likely be a time within just the next century where humans of the future look back to this time of quiet isolation and wonder how we survived. We could ourselves possibly see a day when advanced superintelligences work together with humanity to craft a singularity with compromise, choice, and a preservation of individual autonomy, which still allows us to advance. And perhaps this video and others like it will one day be viewed in historical records, where our descendants, and perhaps immortal future selves, can look back upon our theories, our hopes, and our fears, and laugh at just how off the mark we really ended up being. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.